Representative democracy in Europe often works in remarkable ways, I think. One example is the ACTA agreement, the anti-counterfeiting agreement. It was defeated in the European Parliament in the end after long negotiations of governments from Europe, from the rest of the world, including the European Commission. But the opposition did not start in Brussels. It started in Poland, in Warsaw. In February of the same year, where it in the end was defeated in July. The protests on the streets of Warsaw were initially oriented towards the government of Poland, but also they already challenged directly the representation of the European Parliament in Warsaw. And from Warsaw, protests went to other cities in Poland, and then you saw that opposition also emerged in the rest of the Union. And parliaments that initially had been rather open to the ACTA agreement started to become more critical. The Polish government suspended its ratification process. In the Dutch parliament the same happened, and then eventually the European Parliament killed the treaty. What this shows, I think, is that representation in Europe works through very many channels, and influence may originate all over the place. And in the end, the bottom line here is that parliamentary sovereignty in Europe remains deeply dispersed. And that's the central claim of the argument that I want to make here. Parliamentary sovereignty in Europe is not concentrated. And we still have to get used to that idea, how that may work. We're so used to the idea that parliaments are sovereign and that they centralize the power in one place. In Europe, however, we have parliaments operating at two different levels, and it's not the central parliament that has the greatest political or democratic authority. The main sources of democratic authority remain at the national level, but it remains fragmented there, and they cannot shoulder it by themselves. They certainly also need that parliament at the European level. And this state of dispersion of sovereignty also reflects, I think, and affects the way that academics study it. We know a lot about its parts. We know how the European Parliament works in ever greater detail. We know how national parliaments mobilize, but we find it very hard to grasp the totality of things. And in the end, of course, we can only assess Europe's parliamentary democracy if we can look at the whole. But how do we make sense of that? And I think that remains a continuing challenge. Now, the obvious place to start is simply to look at the treaty. So in the Treaty of Lisbon, it's spelled out that the Union is indeed founded on representative democracy and not on any kind of other democracy, deliberative, direct. No, the central idea is representative democracy. And it primarily works through two channels. One, the direct representation through the European Parliament. The other, the indirect representation working through national parliaments that mandate the governments that then decide collectively in the Council and the European Council on things. And this, many people may have thought, is not a stable situation. Some people have thought sooner or later the first channel, the direct representation, should take the lead, or indeed it's going to revert back to the primacy of national parliaments. But the thing is that the two operate side by side. It's now in the treaty, and it's probably here to stay. But it's messy. Above all, because we would expect, indeed, the center to take the lead, because there things come together, it's the higher level, but in fact, what we see is that political allegiance, political identification, and indeed political legitimacy and authority remain primarily located at the national level. And this has serious implications once you start to think about it. If we don't have a clear sense of concentrated parliamentary authority in Europe, a lot of the key notions of how we expect a parliamentary system or a parliamentary democracy to work fall apart. So there is not a unified actor, but also in Europe you see a competition of what's the most authoritative actor in the European Union. And in principle, of course, we would think that's supposed to be a parliament. And that's also what you see in the treaties. The first institutional article in the treaties is about the European Parliament. But in fact, we know, of course, that to some extent, for instance, the European Council, where we see the heads of state and government come together, carries much greater authority. And may well rival also for its credibility in the eyes of the citizens with the European Parliament. What's even more important is that we expect Parliament to, in a way, to be the protector of the rule of law. The idea is that in a democratic state, no public authority can be exercised without being mandated by a law, directly or indirectly. And that every law has to be approved by Parliament. And that notion is not assured in Europe. Because the European Parliament does not have control over all decisions that are being made. And decisions that escape its control don't necessarily allow each and every national parliament to veto them. So there is a gap here in parliamentary control. It's in financial matters, it's in some of the executive decisions of the agricultural policy. It's certainly also in many of the responses that have been taken to the euro crisis. So basically what we have is that there's no effective subordination of the lower level to the higher level. And indeed we see that national parliaments have their own ways to influence European decision making directly, and even in a way preempt the European Parliament by the early warning mechanism, but also by working behind the scenes. Often you find that in the end the National Party has greater authority than the European faction, or the faction of that party in the European Parliament. Here I get, of course, to the term that has been conceived by John Eric and me, the multilevel parliamentary field, and it's the main aim here is really to have a non-presumptuous concept of how parliaments operate in Europe, to get rid of any supposition in a way that there is a hierarchy, that there is a given logic to the system, and really to open that up and say, well, yes, let's face it, there are parliaments, people are being represented, but they are all over the place, they are very heterogeneous, and they operate in different forms and along different channels, and we don't know really how it adds up. So let's first look what happens, how that field indeed operates as a whole. What dynamics do we see there, rather than that we assume them to fall neatly into place in a way that resembles the way that we expect or have been used when we think about parliamentary democracy. What's more, the field is certainly not a completed structure. It's really an analytical device to look at the evolution of parliaments operating in the European Union. But what's important is that it's really an attempt to grasp the totality. It's not just about focusing on individual achievements of parliaments. In the end, decisions are coming out of this European political system, and we have to know how we are represented in that process as a collective. How can we really say that the people have spoken once the decision is decided, it's made? So what can we see? I think if we take that step back, then the idea is that by adopting this lens, the multilevel parliamentary field, we are looking at different aspects of what parliamentarians do in Europe. And I want to highlight four kind of aspects that come to light then. One is the simple matter of influence, and ACTA was already a nice example. What you see is that influence can be mobilized from very different sides. It can start, say, with trade unions lobbying the Swedish parliament and igniting a broader opposition movement against the EU Services Directive. It can start with a Danish parliament taking the lead in trying to get an early warning against the Monti II directive, and it then finds its way in a kind of ripple, bit by bit, to Europe, and may in the end revise or disable decisions. And there are many different roads that lead to influence there. The second one, and we've discussed that before, is very much about motivation, and that's a critical issue. We have to face that especially for national parliamentarians, they play a role, they are an integral part in a way you can say of the EU political system, but European affairs is not where their heart is most of the time, and also certainly not where their biggest benefits are to be found. It's difficult to exercise influence in Europe, the costs are high, and still some of them do it some of the time. And the question is very much when and why do they become active? And I think what is interesting here is that they do maintain these contacts in all kinds of formal settings. They do travel to meet up in interparliamentary conferences. And I would even say that EU affairs has risen a bit as a portfolio for parliamentarians as far as the pecking order of national factions are concerned. Now, a third process that I think it comes to the fore is emulation. That you see that across the field, across parliaments in Europe, we see parliaments facing similar challenges and looking at each other how they solve them, and at the same time tailoring responses time and time again to their own particular context. So the classical example is, of course, how many of the new parliaments that entered the European Union in 2004 and 2006 were influenced by the practice in particularly the Danish and the Finnish parliament of how scrutiny of EU decision-making was organized by these parliaments. Now, and finally, of course, we get to the point of coordination. And of course, the general line is it does not add up. But still, what we see is, of course, that it takes a wide range of forms. And it's often easier to focus on the formal forms of coordination that takes place, the early warning mechanism, the interparliamentary conferences. But of course, much of it really takes place simply by phone, email, and informal contacts between parliamentarians, or indeed on websites that we don't know about. So in that sense, there's probably quite a bit going on, and that I think certainly we cannot measure this, but the awareness of parliamentarians of each other's works in other countries across Europe, I think, is much higher than it was like 20 years ago. What we do know is, of course, that there's no natural harmony between parliamentarians. Parliamentarians are political animals, and they have different interests, and parliaments have different interests, and certainly national parliaments and European parliaments often have very different interests. But what you need here is, of course, often entrepreneurs. You need parliaments that really feel like here's something to be gained, and who see an opportunity to mobilize other parliamentarians to push their cause. And it helps if that parliament is quite strong or has a certain standing in Europe or a certain credibility, or indeed if the particular parliamentarian has context and standing. So let me conclude. What we have here is that the EU is structurally handicapped to operate as a recognizable democratic system, particularly because we cannot assume parliamentary sovereignty to be concentrated. Its handicap really may be that it's built upon already well-functioning existing national democracies. And here the thing is that fact does not make the whole automatically democratic. And that situation, that condition, I think, challenges us conceptually and also empirically to look for the whole again. And I guess that's what we tried to kind of bring into view by proposing this concept of a multi-level parliamentary field.